How did the longest war ever fought on Australian soil kill more people per year than World War II, and then get erased from every history book in the country? A professor of history began teaching in 1966 and discovered that the official textbooks of this nation mentioned Aboriginal people exactly twice. Not twice per chapter, not twice per decade. Twice in the entire history of a country that had been at war for 140 years. Forget everything you were taught about how this continent was settled. Today we are opening the archives that governments tried to bury, confronting the institutions that still refuse to acknowledge what happened, and restoring the names of the warriors who fought a war that official Australia spent 2 centuries pretending never occurred. There is a wall in Canberra with the names of every Australian who died in every war this country has ever fought. We will return to that wall. Tell me in the comments, did you learn about this in school? Because what you are about to discover will permanently change your answer to that question. Then let's go. To understand the scale of what was suppressed, one must first understand the legal architecture of the suppression itself, because this was not a cover-up born of shame alone. It was a cover-up built into the founding documents of the nation, engineered from the very first morning the ships arrived, and maintained by the highest courts in the land for 2 full centuries. The British colonization of Australia commenced when the First Fleet established a penal colony at Sydney Cove on the 26th of January, 1788. The land, by official proclamation, belonged to nobody. Terra nullius. Empty. Uninhabited. Available. The fact that between 300,000 and 3 million Indigenous Australians had been living on this continent for at least 60,000 years was not, in the legal calculus of the British Empire, a complication. It was an inconvenience to be managed. But the fiction created an immediate problem that no legal document could solve. Aboriginal people had been declared subjects of the British Crown, which meant, in the precise language of imperial law, that Britain could not officially declare war on them. To do so would mean declaring war on its own citizens. The Empire resolved this contradiction with characteristic efficiency. It simply never declared war. It deployed soldiers. It issued ammunition. It authorized killing. It created and funded and armed a paramilitary force whose sole operational purpose was the violent elimination of Aboriginal resistance to settler occupation. And then it wrote all of it down in language so carefully constructed that the word massacre never appeared once. They called it dispersal. They called it collision. They called it affray. They called it land clearing. The war that could not be named was fought under 1,000 different names, and every one of them meant the same thing. Within months of the First Fleet landing, in May of 1788, 5 convicts were killed, and 1 Aboriginal man wounded in the earliest recorded violent exchange. The pattern of reprisal was established before the colony was a year old. What followed was not the peaceful settlement that subsequent generations of Australians were taught to celebrate. It was a systematic, continent-wide campaign that lasted from 1788 until at least 1928, and in some accounts, into the early 1930s. 140 years. No other war in Australian history comes close. The Anglo-Boer War lasted 3 years. The First World War lasted 4. The Second World War lasted 6. Vietnam lasted 20. The frontier wars lasted 140 years, and the country that emerged from them has spent most of the time since pretending they never happened. The indigenous population of Australia fell from an estimate of between 300,000 and 3 million at first contact to approximately 90,000 by 1901. Historians and demographers argue about how much of that catastrophic collapse can be attributed to disease, to displacement, to the destruction of food sources, and how much to direct killing. What they do not argue about is that the killing happened on a scale that strains comprehension, or that the institutions of government designed and funded the machinery that carried it out. Some scholars have attempted to minimize these numbers. Others have attempted to maximize them. The evidence that survives, carefully examined by researchers who have spent careers in the archives, points consistently toward a death toll that makes this conflict one of the most lethal colonial wars ever fought on any continent. There is a wall in Canberra with the names of every Australian who died in every war this nation has ever fought. We will return to that wall. The war's most concentrated, and by certain measures, most ferocious theater was not on the mainland at all. It was on the island at the bottom of the continent, in the colony then called Van Diemen's Land, where British settlement had arrived from 1803, and where, for the first 2 decades, the relationship between colonists and Aboriginal people had been uneasy, but not yet catastrophic. What changed was sheep. By the early 1820s, nearly 1 million sheep had been driven into the prime grazing lands of Tasmania's interior, which were the traditional hunting grounds of 9 Aboriginal nations whose entire subsistence economy depended on those same landscapes. The kangaroo population, the foundation of Aboriginal food supply, began to collapse. The sealing industry that operated from the Bass Strait Islands had been kidnapping Aboriginal women and children for years, stripping communities of their most vulnerable members, and leaving a legacy of grief and rage that the colonial authorities in Hobart preferred not to examine too closely. And as the settler population grew from fewer than 3,000 Europeans in the earliest years to more than 23,000 by 1830, the pressure on Aboriginal land intensified to a point that left no room for coexistence. The violence that erupted from 1824 onward was not, as subsequent colonial accounts framed it, a series of unpredictable native outrages against innocent settlers. It was organized, coordinated, and strategically sophisticated armed resistance. Aboriginal war parties from multiple nations began operating in concert across the island, burning farms, destroying livestock, attacking isolated outposts, and demonstrating a tactical intelligence that the colonists, to their credit in the historical record, found genuinely terrifying. Attacks on colonial properties numbered 20 in 1824. By 1830, they had reached 259. The human cost to the colonial population was staggering by any measure. 223 colonists were killed, and 226 were wounded. To grasp the true scale of this, consider the following comparison. The annual per capita death rate among colonists during what became known as the Black War was 2.5 times higher than the annual per capita death rate of Australian soldiers during World War II. Almost every colonist on the island knew someone who had been killed. Farms were being burned faster than they could be rebuilt. Livestock was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Serious people with serious resources were genuinely contemplating whether the colony could survive at all, and whether abandonment was the only rational response to an enemy they could not locate, could not predict, and could not suppress. Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, who took charge of the colony in 1824, understood that the situation required a response of extraordinary scale. He declared martial law in 1828, which authorized Aboriginal people to be shot on sight by any colonist who encountered them in the settled districts. He issued hundreds of guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition directly to settlers. He blurred every distinction between military personnel and civilians, granting former soldiers civil powers and encouraging them to join punitive expeditions into the bush. He placed bounties on Aboriginal people. He organized roving parties of armed men to scour the countryside for months at a time. And when none of this was sufficient to break the resistance, in October of 1830, He organized what remains the largest single ground offensive in Australian colonial history, the operation that became known as the Black Line. 2,200 free settlers, military officers, police, and convicts spread themselves across the settled districts of Tasmania and began marching south, forming a human chain across the width of the island, designed to drive the remaining Aboriginal population onto the Tasman Peninsula and trap them there, like animals corralled before a slaughter. 10% of the colony's entire adult male population mobilized for this single operation. It failed, in the narrow tactical sense, catching only 2 Aboriginal people after weeks of exhausting movement through the most difficult terrain on the island. But the psychological effect on the already diminished Aboriginal nations was decisive. They were exhausted. They were outnumbered. They were dying not just from bullets, but from the accumulated weight of dispossession, starvation, and the destruction of every social structure that had sustained them for 40,000 years. Between 1831 and 1835, a government agent named George Augustus Robinson and a group of Aboriginal negotiators made contact with the surviving clans and secured their surrender through a combination of persuasion, promises, and the simple fact that continued resistance had become impossible. What Robinson called a friendly mission was in practice the organized removal of the Tasmanian Aboriginal population to a settlement on Flinders Island in Bass Strait, where inadequate food, no shelter suited to the climate, rampant introduced disease, and the accumulated psychological trauma of total dispossession continued to kill them long after the fighting had stopped. From a pre-contact population estimated between 3,000 and 7,000 people, the Aboriginal nations of Tasmania were reduced to fewer than 200 survivors by the end of the conflict. The scholar Nicholas Clements estimates 900 Aboriginal deaths in the Eastern conflict alone between 1824 and 1831, with the total across the entire island potentially exceeding 1,000. It was a destruction so complete, so rapid, and so total that when the lawyer Raphael Lemkin was formulating the legal concept of genocide after the Second World War, he included Tasmania as one of his founding case studies. He did not include it as a historical curiosity. He included it as an example of the thing he was trying to make illegal. Tasmania was not an anomaly in the story of Australian colonization. It was a preview of what was coming. Across the water on the mainland, the war was entering its bureaucratic phase, the moment when colonial governments moved from improvised violence to institutionalized violence, and designed a specific instrument to do their killing in a way that could be officially described in language that would not trouble London. The word that instrument operated under was dispersal. It was not a word from any dictionary of military tactics or criminal law. It was a word invented for this specific purpose, a piece of administrative language engineered to mean one thing on paper and another thing entirely in the red dust and the silence of the inland country. When the Queensland Surveyor General's Department received a letter in 1860 noting that a native police detachment had conducted a dispersal of Aboriginal people in a remote pastoral district. Every person in that office who read that letter understood exactly what had happened. Not one of them was required to write it down more plainly. The language protected them all. The Native Mounted Police was formed by the New South Wales government in 1848 under its first commandant, Frederick Walker, and transferred to the newly separated colony of Queensland when it achieved independence in 1859. Queensland's first governor, Sir George Bowen, wrote to London to report that he had organized a local constabulary that included the Native Mounted Police, which he described as a corps of 100 black troopers stationed in detachments in the remote pastoral districts of the interior for the protection of the outlying settlers from the attacks of the Aborigines. He hoped to extend the force into those inland districts, where settlers were still exposed to danger from native tribes, which were, he noted, with what reads in retrospect as remarkable candor, far more numerous and more formidable in Queensland than in any other portion of Australia. What he did not write in his letter to London, what no one wrote anywhere in any official correspondence throughout the entire history of this force, was the actual operational doctrine of the unit he was describing. The native mounted police did not arrest Aboriginal people. It did not gather evidence. It did not conduct trials, and it did not take prisoners. It killed. That was its function. That was its purpose. From the first day it rode out from its first camp to the last day it was finally disbanded, quietly and without ceremony, in the early 1900s. The structure of the force was itself a weapon of psychological warfare as much as a military one. Its troopers were Aboriginal men, recruited deliberately from nations far removed from the regions where they would operate, ensuring that they would have no cultural connection, no kinship ties, no shared language, and no human relationship with the people they were ordered to kill. A man from the coastal southeast would be deployed to the western interior. A man from the riverine country of the south would be sent to the tropical far north. He would be given a horse, a rifle, a uniform, and a white commanding officer who held his life and his freedom in his hands. He would be offered rations and a wage that bore no relationship to what a white man doing equivalent work might expect. Many deserted, often in large groups at the first opportunity. Those who remained, whether through circumstance or coercion or the absence of any alternative, were deployed in detachments of 6 to 8 men across nearly 200 camps that stretched along the ever-expanding frontier, first through the southeast of the colony, then west into the interior, then north into the tropical savanna country, always following the pastoral expansion like a shadow that arrived just ahead of the cattle and just behind the first reports of Aboriginal resistance. Over the 50 years of the force's active operation, were more than 450 non-Indigenous officers and more than 1,000 Aboriginal troopers passed through its ranks. At any given moment, approximately 200 men were in the field. The camps were established in strategic locations calculated to place armed units within riding distance of every section of the advancing frontier. Archaeologists who have spent years excavating these camps have found them saturated with the physical evidence of the force's function. At the Burke River Camp, at the Cluny Camp, at the Baralga Camp, researchers cataloged more than 100 bullets and cartridges at each site, an unexpected abundance that speaks, in the language of material culture, to what these camps were actually for. What those men did in the field is documented, obliquely but unmistakably, in the Queensland State Archives. The Justice Department records include dozens of coronial inquests into sudden and violent deaths of Aboriginal people at the hands of the native police, with associated correspondence and court records that navigate carefully around the question of what actually happened and how it should be characterized. The Colonial Secretary's office holds letters from settlers requesting protection, reports from officers describing the outcomes of expeditions in the vocabulary of dispersal and collision, and administrative responses that manage to acknowledge the killing while simultaneously refusing to name it for what it was. When allegations of massacre were raised in the colonial parliament, and the official response was filed with a note in the archive stating that if there is any evidence or information in support of these crimes mentioned, it should have been supplied to the Colonial Secretary or to the commissioners for ameliorating the condition of the Aborigines. A government office receiving reports of mass murder conducted by its own uniformed force in its own name responded by asking the victims to submit the paperwork. The circularity of this logic wasn't accidental, it was the point. The most powerful testimony to what the native police actually represented in the daily experience of the people it hunted came from a single voice recorded in 1882. An Aboriginal woman, describing the troopers to a colonial observer, used the word Murnian. It was the same word she used for a rifle. She did not separate the weapon from the men who carried it, and in refusing to make that separation, she expressed something that no official document in the Queensland State Archives was ever permitted to say directly. These men were not police in any sense that the word had meaning outside the colonial vocabulary of euphemism. They were instruments of execution, wearing police uniforms, and the people they hunted understood this with a clarity that the people who sent them out could not afford to acknowledge. The evidence that bodies needed to be destroyed to conceal the truth of what had happened was treated as standard operational practice across the entire history of the force and throughout the broader frontier war. A doctor who traveled to examine the site of one reported killing found nothing at all when he arrived. A large fire had been built over the remains the previous night. The bones had been crushed, the ashes scattered. This procedure was followed so consistently across so many decades and so many different locations in so many different parts of the continent that it constitutes in itself a kind of doctrine, an unwritten operational order that was never formally issued, never put into any training manual or official circular, and yet was universally understood and executed by the men in the field with a consistency that speaks to exactly how normalized it had become. It is why the death toll of this war will never be known with certainty. The victims were not counted in life because they were not legally counted as people. Their bodies were destroyed in death because bodies were evidence. Their names, in the overwhelming majority of cases, were never recorded at all. Historians Raymond Evans and Robert Ørsted Jensen, applying statistical modeling to primary source data drawn from the Queensland archives, estimated that the native mounted police alone was responsible for the deaths of more than 41,000 Aboriginal people in Queensland between 1859 and 1897. When they extended the operational lifespan of the camps to align with newly identified archaeological and documentary data, that estimate increased to potentially more than 60,000. Across the entire continent, Evans and Ørsted Jensen concluded that the total death toll from frontier violence during the 19th and early 20th centuries was probably no less than 100,000 people. The University of Newcastle's Colonial Frontier Massacres Project, led by Professor Lyndall Ryan and applying the most conservative possible methodology, counting only confirmed incidents involving 6 or more victims in a single operation, has documented 438 massacre sites with a minimum confirmed death toll of 10,657. The gap between 10,000 and 100,000 is not a measure of scholarly uncertainty or methodological disagreement. It is a direct and proportional measure of how thoroughly the evidence was destroyed by the men who created it. There was one moment when the evidence was not destroyed, one instance in the entire 140 years of this war, when the machinery of colonial law functioned as its founders claimed it was designed to function, and the killing was brought before a court and judged for what it was. On the 10th of June, 1838, at Mile Creek Station in the New England region of northern New South Wales, a group of 11 stockmen, 10 convicts, and 1 free settler rode onto the property and killed 28 Wurriere people who had been camped there for several weeks under an informal arrangement of protection with one of the station hands. The Wurriere people had helped with work on neighboring properties. They had spent evenings by the campfire with the convict workers assigned to the station. They were preparing their evening meal when the riders arrived. The men who had gone out that morning to cut bark on a neighboring property returned in the late afternoon to find that everyone they had left behind was gone. The bodies had been piled together and burned. What happened next was extraordinary in the precise sense that it had never happened before and would not happen in anything like this form again. A neighboring settler traveled to Sydney and reported the massacre directly to the newly appointed Governor Gibbs, a humanitarian administrator who had been charged by London with applying the principle that indigenous people were entitled to equal protection under British law. Gibbs sent Police Magistrate Edward Denny Day to investigate. Day did his job with a thoroughness and moral seriousness that was entirely exceptional in this context. He arrested 11 of the 12 perpetrators. Only the ringleader, a free settler named John Henry Fleming, who was the only man in the group who was not a convict or former convict, managed to evade capture entirely. At 2 trials in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, 7 of the 11 men were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. On the 18th of December, 1838, they were publicly hanged at Sydney Jail. They were the first British subjects ever to be executed for the massacre of Aboriginal people, and they remain among the very few anywhere in the history of the frontier wars. The reaction of settler society to this outcome reveals the precise moral universe in which these events were unfolding. The Sydney Herald declared in language that was published without apparent embarrassment that the whole gang of black animals was not worth the money the colonists would have to pay for the cost of the proceedings. The landowner class, the squatter interest, the men whose economic survival depended on the native police clearing the country ahead of their cattle, were united in their assessment. This had been judicial murder of white men for the killing of blacks. The prosecution itself had been an outrage, and they drew from the executions a practical conclusion that was the precise opposite of what the justice system had intended. The killings did not stop. In many districts, they intensified. What changed was the operational approach. Perpetrators no longer openly acknowledged what they had done. They burned the bodies more thoroughly. They coordinated the silence within their communities more carefully and more deliberately. They adopted and enforced the vocabulary of dispersal and collision and affray that left nothing legally actionable in the record. See, 7 men were hanged at Sydney Jail on a December morning in 1838. Hundreds of men who did comparable things in the decades that followed were never charged. Thousands of incidents were never investigated. Mile Creek did not teach the colonial frontier that massacre was wrong. It taught the colonial frontier that massacre required better evidence management. The lesson was learned completely and applied for the next 90 years. John Henry Fleming, the man who organized the killing and whose freedom of movement allowed him to escape before the arrests, spent several years living quietly among relatives and sympathizers. He then married. He farmed. He became a justice of the peace. He became a church warden. He died, decades after the morning at Mile Creek, so as a respected pillar of his community along the Hawkesbury River, having never appeared in a court to answer for what he had done. This was not an exception to how the frontier operated. This was exactly how the frontier operated. To understand what the native police was designed to destroy, one must look directly at the people it was designed to hunt. Because the story that has survived in the official record, the comfortable story of a largely peaceful and essentially unopposed settlement of an empty continent, bears no resemblance to the story that Aboriginal communities preserved in their oral traditions, their relationship to country, and their ceremony. The warriors of the Australian frontier are not well known in the broader culture of the nation they helped to shape. This is not because they were ineffective or because their resistance was insignificant. It is because their effectiveness was precisely what the official record most urgently needed to erase. Pemulwuy was a Bidjigal man of the Darug Nation, born around 1750 near what is now Botany Bay. He was tall and powerfully built, with a distinctive blemish in his left eye and a turned foot that some accounts suggest marked him as a Caridi, a cleverman, a figure with spiritual as well as military authority in his community. He watched the first fleet arrive in 1788. He watched the colonists begin clearing land that Aboriginal people had cultivated for generations, depleting the fish populations that Aboriginal communities depended on, and expanding their farms into Bidjigal country with a relentlessness that left no room for negotiation or accommodation. In December of 1790, Pemulwuy speared John McIntyre, the gamekeeper of Governor Phillip, a man who had made himself notorious among Aboriginal people for his personal role in killing Eora and Darug people and for the desecration of sacred places. The governor dispatched a military expedition to find and punish the perpetrator. The expedition found nobody. What followed was 12 years of organized guerrilla warfare across the Cumberland Plains, conducted with a strategic consistency that contemporary observers found both impressive and alarming. Pemulwuy's campaigns included the systematic burning of farms, the destruction of grain crops, raids on government stores and settler outposts, and the sustained harassment of colonial agriculture across an area of country that the colonists had assumed they had secured. In March of 1797, he led approximately 100 warriors in a direct assault on the government farm at Toongabbie, then marched on Parramatta itself in what became known as the Battle of Parramatta. He was shot 7 times in that engagement. He survived. The belief spread among both Aboriginal and European populations that he could not be killed by British bullets, and for years this belief was reinforced by his continued survival and continued operations against the colony. Governor Philip Gidley King, who found himself simultaneously admiring and threatened by Pemulwuy, issued an order authorizing settlers to shoot any Aboriginal person on sight in the areas around Parramatta, George River, and Prospect. He placed a cash bounty on Pemulwuy's head, dead or alive. In June of 1802, a settler named Henry Hacking collected it. Pemulwuy was shot dead. His body was decapitated immediately. His head was packaged and sent to the botanist Joseph Banks in England. The current location of Pemulwuy's head is unknown. Yagan was a Noongar warrior, the son of an influential elder named Midjigoru, born around 1795 on the country of the Swan River in what is now Western Australia. When the Swan River colony was established in 1829 on Whadjuk Noongar country, the Noongar people immediately experienced the pattern that had already played out in New South Wales and Tasmania: the seizure of the most productive land, the destruction of the food sources that sustained Aboriginal communities, the escalating violence of settlers who regarded Aboriginal property rights as non-existent, and the relentless expansion of a population that had no intention of stopping. A Scottish minister who knew Yagan personally and who recognized in him qualities that could not be squared with the colonial narrative of Aboriginal people as primitive and easily subdued, described him as the Wallace of the age, a comparison that understood exactly the nature of what it was acknowledging. In 1832, Yagan was captured and sentenced to death, but so striking was his bearing, and so obvious was his intelligence, that the colonial authorities chose exile to Karnak Island instead. He escaped within a month, stealing a boat with 2 companions, despite having no prior experience of boats or open water, and navigating 13 kilometers back to the mainland by means that colonists who heard the account afterward found difficult to explain. He evaded recapture for a further year. In July of 1833, he was shot dead in an ambush organized by 2 brothers named William and James Keats. His body was decapitated. His head was sent to England, where it was preserved and placed on display in the Liverpool Museum. It remained there for 164 years. It was returned to Australia in 1997. In the country west of the Blue Mountains, a Wiradjuri warrior named Windradine had led what colonial authorities called the Bathurst War between 1820 and 1824. It was a conflict of such intensity that Governor Brisbane declared martial law on the 4th of August, 1824, authorizing the killing of any Aboriginal person found west of Mount York on the Great Dividing Range. The Sydney Gazette described it without apparent discomfort as the exterminating war. What is rarely recorded in the standard accounts is what Windradine chose to do after the military phase of the resistance had run its course. He walked into Parramatta carrying a green branch. He negotiated. He made the strategic calculation that the survival of his people on their country required a different form of resistance, one conducted not with spears, but with presence, endurance, and the refusal to disappear. So it was a form of courage that demanded a different kind of understanding than the charge at Toongabbie or the ambush in the bush, and it has been correspondingly harder for the historical record to accommodate. No such accommodation was available to Jandamara, a Bunuba man known to the colonists by the name Pigeon, born around 1870 in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. His story differs from the others in one decisive and deeply significant respect. When it began, he was on the wrong side. He was wearing the uniform of the colonial police. Raised on Leonard River Station from childhood, he had grown up among European pastoralists and had become, by his early 20s, a man of exceptional practical skills, an outstanding horseman, a gifted tracker, and a person trusted by the colonial authorities with the kind of work that required both physical capability and local knowledge. By the late 1880s, he was employed as a police tracker, which meant he was being paid by the colonial government to hunt down and capture members of his own people who had been killing colonial livestock in defense of their country. In 1894, the Bunuba elders confronted him with the choice that the colonial system had been designed, consciously or not, to make unanswerable. The choice between his people and the institution that employed him. One night in October of that year, while his constable partner was sleeping, Jandamara made his answer. He killed the constable, walked to the jail, and released 16 Bunuba prisoners, many of them his own relatives, who had been captured during resistance operations. He then joined his people in the active defense of Bunuba country against the pastoral expansion that was destroying it. On the 16th of November, 1894, 50 painted Bunuba warriors, under Jandamara's leadership, engaged colonial forces at the Battle of Windjana Gorge in an action that shocked a colonial population that had been assured the resistance in the Kimberley was manageable. Jandamara was severely wounded in the fighting. He retreated into the cave system at Tunnel Creek and spent 2 full years recovering, while the colonial authorities first assumed he was dead, and then, when evidence of continued activity made that assumption impossible to maintain, organized increasingly serious efforts to find him. In 1895, he raided the police station at Lillamalura, the exact station he had once worked from, in an operation whose audacity sent a clear message about what his survival meant for the future of the Bunuba resistance. For 3 years after Windjana Gorge, his intimate knowledge of Bunuba country and his mastery of the European firearms he had learned to use as a police tracker made him effectively uncatchable by any force the colonial authorities could deploy. On the 1st of April, 1897, he was tracked to Tunnel Creek and shot dead by an Aboriginal tracker named Minko Mick, a man deployed specifically because no European tracker possessed the skills to find Jandamara in his own country. His body was decapitated. His head was sent to England, to a firearms manufacturing company, which incorporated it into promotional material designed to demonstrate the effectiveness of its products. 3 men, 3 beheadings, 3 heads sent to England. This was not coincidence, and it was not the uncoordinated behavior of individual colonists acting on personal impulse. The British Empire had conducted colonial warfare across 5 continents and understood, with the institutional intelligence that experience produces, that a warrior's body on country was dangerous long after the life had left it. It could become a place of gathering, a point of pilgrimage, a symbol around which resistance could reconstitute itself across generations. The removal of the head was an act of psychological warfare intended to continue after the physical war had ended. A message delivered not just to the people who had been defeated, but to every person who might ever consider following their example. One of those heads was returned to Australia after 164 years. One was used to sell firearms and has not been returned. One has never been found. If those were the warriors famous enough to have their stories preserved in any form at all, consider what became of the thousands whose names never survived the fires that destroyed the evidence of their deaths. In northwestern Queensland, the answer arrives with a particular precision. The Kalkadoon people occupied the country running from what is now Mount Isa to Cloncurry, ancient and demanding red-earthed country they had managed and inhabited for longer than any written record could measure. A European colonialism arrived in their territory later than in the southeast, the first copper and gold mines appearing in 1870 and the first pastoralists following 4 years afterward. The Kalkadoon met the pastoral expansion immediately with organized and disciplined armed resistance that demonstrated a level of military sophistication that the colonists had not anticipated and were not prepared for. They formed structured war bands. They coordinated simultaneous attacks on multiple pastoral stations across wide geographic areas, an operational achievement that required communication networks, logistical planning, and strategic intelligence gathering. They identified the telegraph lines that allowed the colonial forces to coordinate their responses and targeted the infrastructure directly. They held the frontier against settlement for 10 years, which is to say that for a decade, the economic expansion of the Queensland pastoral industry into their country was effectively impossible. In March of 1884, Sub-Inspector Frederick Charles Urquhart of the Queensland Native Police was assigned to the problem that the Kalkadoon had been creating for the colonial economy. When a prominent pastoralist was killed by Kalkadoon warriors in July of that year, Urquhart's response was not measured. He described what he intended to do as a war of vengeance and committed that description to verse before he began delivering it. Over the following 9 weeks, Urquhart and a combined force of native police troopers and armed pastoralists conducted operations across Kalkadoon country with the explicit objective of ending the resistance permanently. The official records that Urquhart filed subsequently acknowledge that his force had killed approximately 150 people across 3 or 4 operations. The records he chose not to file covered whatever happened in between. In September of 1884, the Kalkadoon made their final military decision as a people. 600 warriors gathered on a ridgeline above the country near what is now Cloncurry, a position selected deliberately for its defensive advantages, its commanding elevation, and the fields of observation it provided over the approaches from below. They had sustained this resistance for 10 years through mobile tactics that exploited their knowledge of the country. On this ridge on this morning, they chose to abandon mobility and make their stand in the open. The colonial force coming up from below was well armed, experienced in frontier operations, and supported by the institutional and logistical resources of a state government that understood its economic future as contingent on clearing this country for cattle. The Kalkadoon charged down the slope. They had the high ground, and for a period of the engagement, they used it with genuine effect. But no tactical advantage of terrain could overcome the disparity in firepower between traditional weapons and the rifles that the colonial force carried. More than 200 warriors died on that ridgeline before the engagement collapsed. The place is called Battle Mountain today, situated near Cloncurry in the state of Queensland. There is a memorial there. The local oral history of the region, preserved by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities across the generations since 1884, carries the memory of what happened on that slope on that morning with a clarity that no official record was designed to provide. What followed the battle was not peace in any meaningful sense of the word. It was the completion of the destruction by other means. Approximately 900 Kalkadoon people died in total across the entire period of the conflict. In direct combat, from arsenic-laced flour distributed as provisions to communities struggling with food insecurity, from blankets deliberately contaminated with measles, and from the poisoning of the waterholes on which survival in that country depended absolutely. The survivors were driven from the country that had defined their entire existence and forced into fringe camps on the margins of the pastoral stations built on the land that had been taken from them. The men most responsible for these operations faced no legal consequences of any kind. Urquhart continued his career without interruption. He rose through the ranks of Queensland law enforcement. He was eventually appointed Queensland Police Commissioner, the highest law enforcement position in the state. The man who had personally directed the killing of more than 150 people across 3 or 4 operations, who had organized a 9-week campaign of violence against a civilian population following the battle, so who had committed his intention to revenge to verse before he began, died in office as the head of the institution responsible for upholding the law. The signal this transmitted to every officer serving under him, and to every officer who would serve in Queensland for the decades that followed, required no translation. The war on the Queensland frontier continued through the 1880s and the 1890s, and ground on into the early years of the 20th century, but its decisive phase was finished. The pattern that had repeated itself across every theater of the conflict, warriors holding country for years or decades through sustained and intelligent resistance before the accumulated weight of superior weapons and institutional support overwhelmed them, played out one final time in the far north and the central desert as the pastoral frontier reached its last extension. And then, in the Northern Territory, in August of 1928, the guns fired for the last time in a form large enough to generate an official response. To understand how recently this happened, consider what 1928 meant in the broader world. Mickey Mouse made his debut on screen. Penicillin was identified in a London laboratory. The first transatlantic telephone call connected 2 continents. The Oxford English Dictionary published its final volume. And 240 miles northwest of Alice Springs, in the middle of a drought that had reduced competition for water to a question of survival, so that a 61-year-old dingo trapper named Frederick Brooks was killed at a waterhole called Yukuru by Warlpiri men acting under the requirements of Warlpiri law. Brooks had been warned by the station owner to stay within a safe distance of the homestead. He ignored the warning. He drove his camels out to a remote waterhole where approximately 30 Warlpiri people were camped, and, according to multiple independent Aboriginal oral accounts that have remained consistent across generations of testimony, made demands involving the wives of a Warlpiri man named Bullfrog that constituted under Warlpiri law a transgression of a specific and serious kind, for which that law prescribed a specific and serious response. The law was applied. Brooks died at Yukuru on approximately the 7th of August, 1928, and Constable William George Murray of the Northern Territory Police received the report, drove to Alice Springs, and telephoned his superintendent. His superintendent told him to return to Coniston Station and to deal with the Aboriginal people as he saw fit. Murray had first been posted to outback policing in 1919, the day after he joined the force, without any training of any kind. He had served in the First World War with the 4th Light Horse Regiment on the Western Front, and returned to civilian life with the experience of industrialized violence that the war had provided. He had spent 9 years on the Northern Territory frontier, absorbing the operational culture of a policing institution that had been shaped by the same assumptions and the same practices that had governed frontier policing in Queensland for the previous 60 years. When he rode out from Coniston Station on the 14th of August, 1928, leading a posse of 7 men, including the station owner Randall Stafford, 2 Aboriginal trackers, and 3 civilian volunteers, he was not conducting a criminal investigation. He was conducting a punitive expedition of precisely the kind that had been conducted on Australian frontiers since the native police first rode out from its first camp in 1848. The normalization was complete. The practice was 80 years old. The men knew what they were doing, and they knew that what they were doing would be understood and accommodated by the institutions above them. What occurred over the 65 days that followed is documented in the widening gap between official records and every other available source. The official Queensland records of the native police era had been maintained in the vocabulary of dispersal and collision. The official record of Coniston was maintained in the same tradition. The Royal Commission held in 1929 concluded that 31 Aboriginal people had been killed, that Murray had acted within the bounds of reasonable conduct, and that no charges were warranted. Randall Stafford, the station owner who had ridden with the posse in the first days of the expeditions, I estimated privately that the number killed in the first 2 weeks alone was at least twice the official total. Historians examining the documentary record alongside the Aboriginal oral histories collected from Warlpiri, Anmatiera, and Kaitetia communities in subsequent decades have estimated the true death toll at between 60 and 110. The Warlpiri people whose family members were killed in those expeditions across those 65 days have maintained consistently across generations that the number was closer to 170. The precise truth will never be established. The same evidence destruction practices that had governed the Queensland frontier for 60 years were applied in the Central Australian desert in 1928, so in a federated Australian nation that had been a modern constitutional state for 27 years. No charges were ever laid. Murray was found to have acted reasonably. He returned to his duties. Every year, the Warlpiri people gather at Ukuru, at Brook's Soak, at the waterhole where it began, to mourn the family members who were killed across those 65 days. An elder named Vince Harrigan has described what was passed down to him through the generations. They were hunted down like animals and shot there, he said. He told the people who came to record his testimony that he could still hear the kids crying and all of the old people. The Coniston Massacre is documented as the last known officially sanctioned massacre of Aboriginal people in Australian history. There are people alive today whose grandparents were alive when it happened. The guns fell silent after Coniston. The bureaucrats took over. And what happened in the decades that followed, the systematic burial of 140 years of history inside the very institutions designed to preserve and interpret the national memory, is perhaps the most sustained and successful concealment operation in the history of this country, because it was conducted not in remote desert country, but in archives and parliamentary chambers and university lecture halls and war memorial exhibition spaces in full public view, and it very nearly succeeded permanently. The physical erasure of evidence had been standard operational practice throughout the war. Bodies burned, bones crushed, remains scattered so thoroughly that no physical evidence could be recovered. For the Aboriginal fallen, one careful historical account concludes, this outcome was entirely deliberate. The standard approach to the bodies of the killed was to dismember them, burn the parts in fires hot enough to destroy bone, and scatter whatever remained so completely that recovery was impossible. This was not conducted in the heat of battle. It was conducted systematically afterward, as a routine component of the operation. It is the direct reason why the death toll of the frontier wars cannot be established with precision and will never be established with precision. The victims were not counted in life because colonial law did not recognize them as legal persons with rights that required accounting. Their bodies were destroyed in death because physical remains were evidence of a crime that the perpetrators and their institutional supporters needed to not exist. The institutional erasure operated in parallel with the physical erasure and outlasted it by decades. Aboriginal people were not included in the Australian census until 1967. For the entire active duration of the frontier wars, the official population of Australia excluded the people being killed in it. The legal doctrine that enabled this exclusion, the concept of terra nullius, was never a formally enacted statute in British law. It developed through accumulation, through the repeated practical assertion that Aboriginal occupation of land did not constitute ownership in any legally cognizable form, elaborated and reinforced across 2 centuries of colonial and then national legal practice, until it was finally challenged in the High Court of Australia and overturned in 1992 in the Mabo decision. Eddie Mabo, a Torres Strait Islander, had spent a decade fighting through the Australian courts to establish that the land his family had occupied for generations belonged to them in a way the law was required to recognize. The High Court agreed. The legal foundation of terra nullius was removed, and with its removal, the central premise of the historical silence also collapsed, because it was no longer legally defensible to maintain that the war could not have been about land that Aboriginal people had never owned. The most visible institutional symbol of the historical silence stands today in Canberra at the Australian War Memorial, a building whose stated mission is to commemorate the sacrifice of Australians who have died in war, and to help Australians understand the Australian experience of war and its enduring impact on the society it shaped. The frontier wars are not commemorated there. The memorial's position, maintained through successive directors, successive governing councils, and successive government ministers over many decades, is that the frontier fighting falls outside its charter because it did not involve forces of the Australian military. This position has been challenged repeatedly and publicly by historians of standing, including Geoffrey Blaney, John Connor, Peter Stanley, and Henry Reynolds, each of whom has noted that colonial military units, paramilitary formations, and the native mounted police, whose officers wore government uniforms and carried government weapons and received government pay, were all involved in frontier violence throughout the entire duration of the conflict. In 2022, filmmaker Rachel Perkins confronted the memorial's director on camera with the question of how this institutional position could be maintained in the face of the available evidence. His response, that when the memorial's own historians examined the question, they could find no evidence of Australian forces engaged in frontier conflict, was answered by Perkins in 4 words. That is absolutely factually incorrect. The documentary Perkins made, which screened on national television in September of 2022, I forced the most direct public confrontation with this history that the country had yet experienced. The memorial's then chair, Brendan Nelson, announced after viewing it that the governing council had resolved to work toward a much broader and much deeper depiction and presentation of the violence committed against Indigenous people throughout the colonial period. The organized political response to this announcement demonstrated with clarity how contested the territory remained. Conservative political figures, media voices aligned with the rejection of historical accountability, and elements of the veteran community mobilized quickly and effectively to resist any change to what was commemorated and how. The memorial has struggled since 2022 to translate Nelson's announcement into substantive action. The wall in Canberra still carries not one name from 140 years of war fought on Australian soil. What broke the silence, in the end, was not an institution deciding to tell the truth. It was people who refused to stop asking for it. Beginning in the 1970s, a generation of historians entered the archives that governments had accumulated and, in some cases, attempted to restrict, and began building the documentary foundation of an account that could no longer be suppressed by the weight of institutional preference. Henry Reynolds, who had begun his teaching career confronting history textbooks that mentioned Aboriginal people twice in their entire length, spent the decades that followed reconstructing what those textbooks had been built to conceal. Raymond Evans brought the Queensland archival record into systematic scholarly focus. Lyndall Ryan led the painstaking work of the Colonial Frontier Massacres Project, which produced the 438 confirmed massacre sites, now available to any person with an internet connection who wants to understand what actually happened in this country between 1788 and 1928. Jonathan Richards went into the Queensland records and produced the definitive account of the Native Mounted Police. These scholars did not manufacture a history. They recovered one that had been buried. The knowledge these scholars were recovering had never actually been lost in the communities where it originated. The Warlpiri had always known what happened at Coniston. The Kalkadoon had always known what happened at Battle Mountain. The Wiradjuri had always carried the memory of the Bathurst War. The Bunuba had always known Jandamara's story from the inside, in the full complexity that no colonial document was designed to capture. The silence that concealed this history from the broader Australian public was never Indigenous silence. It was the silence of the institutions that had an interest in a particular story about how Australia came to exist and what kind of country it had always been. The Mabo decision removed the legal foundation of that institutional silence. The scholarship of Reynolds and Evans and Ryan and Richards removed the evidentiary foundation. What remained was the political and cultural will to maintain the silence in the absence of any other justification for it. Cal Elwood, whose great-great-grandfather Jack Noble served as an Aboriginal trooper in the Native Mounted Police, has spoken publicly about what that inheritance means for the people who carry it. She cannot change what he did in those camps and on those plains. She does not know what was in his mind when he accepted the horse and the rifle and the uniform and rode out against people who shared his blood and his connection to country. Recognition that it happened, she has said, is more than enough for me. Lance Sullivan, who descends from both a native police officer and a massacre survivor, has said that writing books and talking about it would be a good healing process for Australia. These are not demands for punishment of the living for the actions of the dead. They are requests for the most basic form of historical honesty, acknowledgement that the thing occurred. Today, more than half a century has passed since Henry Reynolds stood before his first class with a textbook that mentioned his country's longest war twice in passing. The maps now exist. The massacre sites are documented and publicly accessible. The names of the warriors, some of them, have been recovered from the records and the oral traditions and the community memories that kept them alive through every institutional effort to let them disappear. The descendants have spoken in public and on record. The scholars have built an evidentiary foundation that cannot be responsibly dismissed. The filmmakers have brought the material to national audiences, and the question of what Australia chooses to do with this knowledge sits right now in parliamentary committees and memorial boardrooms and school curriculum reviews and the ongoing public argument about what deserves to be on that wall in Canberra. The frontier wars were not simply a military event from a distant and irrelevant past. They were a demonstration, conducted over 140 years on the soil of this continent, that a nation can fight its longest and most lethal war against its own people, and then construct, through the accumulated instruments of legal fiction and official silence and deliberate evidence destruction and institutional refusal, a national story in which that war does not appear. This is possible. Australia proved that it is possible. It is possible right up until the moment when the archives are opened and the oral histories are recorded and the massacre sites are mapped and the documentaries are broadcast on national television and the chair of the War Memorial watches one of them and announces, "Live," that something in the national story has to change. That moment came in 2022. The change it promised has not yet fully arrived. The warriors who fought this war, Pemulwuy and Yagan, Windradin and Jandamara, the 600 men who charged down the slope at Battle Mountain, the Warlpiri families who gathered at Ukuru and were hunted across 65 days of desert country in 1928, were not fighting a cause that was doomed by its nature or inevitable in its defeat. They were defending the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, on the land where that civilization began and where it has persisted in one form or another through everything that was done to end it. They lost the military war. They lost it because the force they were fighting had the resources of empire and the legal architecture of erasure and the operational doctrine of evidence destruction behind it. The historical war is still being fought in archives and courtrooms and curriculum debates and the argument over what belongs on that wall in Canberra. Whether they win, it depends, in the end, on how many people decide that an honest accounting of what this country actually did is more important than the comfort of the story it has preferred to tell about itself. Now you know what was buried in the archives. Now you know what was burned in the fires built over the bodies. Now you know what was sent to England in boxes and displayed in museums and used to sell rifles. Now you know what was returned after 164 years and what has never been found. The longest war in Australian history was fought on this soil, in your name, within living memory of people who are still alive today. Now you know.